When you don't have sources, good primary sources, it's hard to write good history, right? That's the whole point. That's when primary sources is really what makes history come alive. So when you don't have an opportunity to write good history or write history in a proper way, items get forgotten or they get misremembered. I think that's really critical.
My thanks to the Old South Meeting House and to the Mass Historical Society for inviting me here tonight. I must note, though, under the theme of misremembered history, the historical founders of this meeting house might be a wee bit appalled that you have invited an Anglican priest to come and preside over this series of talks tonight, but hopefully they will rest in peace and forgive the current curators for that faux pas. I'm honored to share the stage with three distinguished historians tonight, and I'm delighted to introduce our first, Stephen Puleo.
Thanks. Thank you, Steve. Thanks, folks. And I will tell you how appalled the founders would be if there was an Italian-American, to know that an Italian-American is sitting up here now. So yes, totally get that. Listen, I want to say thanks to Mass Historical and the Old South, but most of all, thanks to you folks. Freezing cold night, great crowd. You have plenty of other things you could be doing. Those of you who were up in the second deck, the balcony, tremendous. Yes, thank you so much. Really appreciate you being here. It means a lot to everybody up here. I have had the pleasure and the real blessing to speak to thousands of people on the Molasses Flood in my other books. And when you have a crowd like this, it's very energizing. So thank you guys for being here. Really, really do appreciate it. When I first heard that we were going to do this topic tonight, the misremembering molasses topic, I thought, how interesting is this? Normally I have an opportunity to talk about the flood in general and dark tide and all of that. And within that talk, lots of items come up about how the flood story is misremembered. And I think the essence of it is captured most when I get this question, and I get this question at every single presentation that I do, and it goes something like this: how come I've never heard about this story? How come my history teachers never told me about the Great Boston Molasses Flood? I have lived in Boston my whole life, and I didn't know about this story until I read Dark Tide. Why is that? So that's kind of the essence of what we're going to talk about tonight, is why it's misremembered, why it isn't remembered in many cases, and a couple of the examples that I can give. The examples I love, and you know the examples. One of them, for example, can you still smell molasses on a hot summer day? I'm told you can do that, and so I can tell you for sure that you cannot any longer. I've been down there on summer days, winter days, fall days, windy days, rainy days, snowy days. You can't smell molasses anymore. However, like any good history, there's great folklore that's grown up around it, right? That's, I think, the best history is the folklore that's grown up. And part of the reason that has grown up is that you could smell molasses for decades after the flood. No question about it. There were stories from people who read meter readers from Boston Gas and other companies in the late 50s and early 60s, who, when they went into the cellars of those homes and businesses across the street from where the tank was, they could still smell molasses in those cellars. Now think about it, those cellars are filled up to the first floor with molasses after the flood. So I can definitely see that. It's part of the folklore, that's part of the misremembering. Number two, my other favorite example, is that the entire city of Boston was covered with molasses. From the North End to Hyde Park, covered with molasses. And of course, not true. The molasses flood makes a swath of destruction, I would say about a mile, on Commercial Street, right along Commercial Street, all the way down to about Battery Street, for those of you who know that Commercial Street North End area. And it causes immense destruction, terrible destruction, 21 deaths, 150 people injured, many very, very seriously. But it doesn't get past Copp's Hill. as the Reverend says, Copp's Hill acts as a barrier because it slopes downward towards the harbor. So the wave of molasses recoils off of Copp's Hill. However, here's how that folklore grew up. Molasses was tracked all over the city, right? It was tracked on subways, Boston Elevated subways. It was tracked on payphones. Lots of talk of people having on their earpiece and on their mouthpiece of payphones around the city, molasses. I spoke to a high school group just last week, and they said, wait, what's a payphone? No, cheap laugh, but I'm saying that was part of that. And there were horse troughs around the city, municipal horses that pulled carts and the like around the city. There was molasses in those troughs, so that's how that folklore grows up. But of course, the big misremembering is that this is indeed a tragedy. So when you see headlines, newspaper headlines, even today, that say, what a gooey situation, a sticky situation in the city of Boston, that kind of belies the tragic nature of this. I talk about this a little bit in the author's note of the book. Why is that? And of course, I think the number one, I think of several reasons, but I think the number one reason is the substance itself, right? So when you talk about a molasses flood, it does produce that kind of initial giggle. It does. You have to get past that to get to how harrowing these injuries and deaths were. People literally smothering or asphyxiating in molasses. People with broken backs and fractured skulls and pelvises from debris that gets swept up in the wave. And I think the reason for that kind of attitude goes back to that question, why haven't I heard about this disaster? And the reason, I think, is that there weren't many sources available. Until Dark Tide came along, I was very blessed in many ways because I was able to find sources that had never been used before, primarily the damage awards that were used in the huge civil suit that followed the flood, the awards that were used to give money to the victims, 119 plaintiffs, so the family members of the deceased and those who were injured. And then secondly, I was very blessed, and an archivist for the Superior Court found both of these for me, the damage awards and the 25,000 pages of testimony in the court case, 40 volumes worth, located at the Social Law Library in Government Center. Brian Harkins from Social Law is here. He knows I spent hours there, copied thousands of pages, and still send people to him today when they ask about that testimony. But that was because of this work, a work of this great archivist who was able to track down the sources. So when you don't have sources, good primary sources, it's hard to write good history, right? That's the whole point. That's when primary sources is really what makes history come alive. So when you don't have an opportunity to write good history or write history in a proper way, items get forgotten or they get misremembered. I think that's really critical. Couple of other smaller reasons, I think. Number two, Boston, I think, considers itself a big history city, right? Justifiably so. Great Revolution history, great abolitionist history, great immigration history, you name it. These people that were killed in the molasses flood are very ordinary people. You would not have heard about them then, and you might not ever hear about them again. Mostly Irish city workers and Italian immigrants, people who worked around the site and people who lived around the site. So sometimes I think that causes us to misremember or even to not remember. So I think all of those things come together, this kind of lack of sources, the substance itself, right? And the ordinary nature of the people who are killed. Now, there's history movements, and there have been for years and years, on history from the bottom up. How do we tell history from the bottom up? But I mean, it hasn't been going on that long. 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, take your pick. Historians will disagree and agree on when it is. But it hasn't gone on that long, and so sometimes things fall between the cracks. So that's kind of my little speech on how I think this flood has been misremembered and why it's been misremembered. For those of you who have read Dark Tide, and I talked to many of you, thank you so much, you know that this is a story of a tragedy, of a real drama. It's a very dramatic event, and it also has a lot of big history implications. The anarchist movement works its way through it. World War I and munitions works its way through it. Immigration themes work its way through it. So it's the best kind of history in my view. It's a great story, and the story kind of pulls the big history along, which is the way I think history should be told, right? I've had people say to me, the history goes down easy in this book. All right, that's good. That's a positive. History, I think, should always go down easy. Sometimes in the way we teach it, the way we write it, the way we think about it, there's this notion that history should be a chore, that it should be hard. It should always go down easy. You should enjoy the big history almost in spite of yourself, which is why you should tell history as a story. So I think that's my reasons for Dark Tide and for the Molasses Flood being a little bit misremembered. And I'm going to pass the mic, and we'll get to more during questions if that works for you guys. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Allison.
Hello. Thank you so much for being here today. I'm very excited to talk to you about suffragists, especially the suffragists that we really remember. So today I'm going to talk to you about Lucy Stone and Josephine Ruffin. Has anyone ever heard of them before? Some of us, amazing, that's wonderful. My students have definitely never heard of either of them before when they come to my class. And so today we're going to talk about both of them, but since we are doing misremembered history, and probably it's been a while since most of us have taken a history class, I just want to get a sense, what do you guys think of when you think of the women's suffrage movement in the United States? Who do you think of? What do you think of? Alice Paul, Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. You guys are saying exactly what I want you to say. Seneca Falls Convention and the Declaration of Sentiments, which really outlined what the goals of the movement were in 1848. So yes, I wanted to get to Stanton and Anthony because they are one of the reasons why we misremember the history of the suffrage movement today. I want you to know two things about them. One is that they wrote the very first history of women's suffrage, the first comprehensive history of women's suffrage. Starting in 1881, they actually created 6 volumes of the history of women's suffrage that were over 1,000 pages each. So this is something that includes primary sources, includes their essays, and you can imagine that these documents significantly influence how we still tell the story about suffrage in the United States, even today, even over a century after they were the finished publications. The other thing you need to know about them is that they finessed their story. They made sure that once you finished reading these stories, that they were the ones that you'd remember, and that would be in our textbooks today. And I'd say they were pretty successful, given your responses tonight. So they were the ones who wanted to make sure that you remembered the Declaration of Sentiments in Seneca Falls. That was probably maybe like the one thing that was in your high school history textbook. So usually the history textbooks start there with the Declaration of Sentiments, and then maybe they talk about the first national suffrage organizations in 1869, one of which was started by Stanton and Anthony. And then perhaps they dive into, paraders and protests in the 1910s before the passage of the amendment in 1920. They often do not talk about Lucy Stone and Josephine Ruffin. And one of the reasons for that is that Stanton and Anthony really chose who they wanted to focus on in their book. For one thing, we probably don't usually think of male suffragists, right? They really did not emphasize the men who were really significant part of this movement. They also really didn't emphasize women of color who participated in this movement as well. Miss Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, who was a prominent reformer in the mid-19th century, criticized them for their lack of concern for African American women's rights, and they did not include her in their history of women's suffrage. So the other thing that they did not like was Lucy Stone, and that's partially because Lucy Stone actually had a far larger organization than them, and while their women's rights newspaper lasted from 1870 to 1872, hers lasted from 1870 through the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920. Extremely far-reaching piece. So here's Lucy Stone, and she was born in Massachusetts in 1818 and lived here through 1893, and her daughter really carried on her legacy. So she became the first woman in Massachusetts to graduate from college with an undergraduate degree, and she graduated from Oberlin College, which was among the first universities to accept women to their regular college programs. And so she became very involved in the anti-slavery movement, became a lecturer, which was very controversial to be a female lecturer in the 1840s and 1850s, but she integrated women's rights history into her lectures. By the time the Civil War ended and the 15th Amendment, which, as you might recall, granted African American men the right to vote, came around, Lucy Stone fully supported it. She and her husband, Henry Brown Blackwell did, along as many other people, but Stanton and Anthony actually lobbied against it. And so that's why they created two different organizations. And she created this organization that was far more popular, far larger, far more kind of mainstream than Stanton and Anthony's. And she also created the Women's Journal, and this is where the offices were, right on Park Street, not very far away, right down the street from the State House, and that's where they stayed for a while. And this was really a family affair. She worked with her husband, Henry Brown Blackwell, who often edited the paper, and then ultimately her daughter, Alice Stone Blackwell, took it over and worked really hard so that those of you who did know Lucy Stone, I think that partially we have her to thank for that memory today, because she wrote a book about her and really ensured that we'd at least remember some portraits of her too. So the other woman I want to speak about is Josephine Ruffin. And Josephine Ruffin was an African-American woman who grew up in Boston. And she, like Stone, was a major advocate against slavery, in favor of civil rights during the Civil War era. And what she noticed about the mainstream suffrage movements is that they really weren't thinking about the concerns of women of color in the United States. So by the 1890, she decides to create a new organization in Boston, the Women's Era, and a newspaper to go with it. And so this is one of the earliest newspapers we have that is specifically aimed at looking at the needs of African American women and what they really want. Just to remind you, 1890s, this is the moment when Mississippi State Constitution starts this array of laws to kind of prevent African American men from voting, poll taxes, literacy tests, these are all happening. Plessy versus Ferguson, which supports segregation, separate and equal is okay in 1896. All of these things are happening, just to remind you, at the same time. 1895, actually in Boston, Josephine Ruffin decides to call a meeting of the leading African American women from across the United States. They meet in Berkeley Hall in Boston. Josephine Ruffin is on the top left. And another group meets actually in Atlanta the same year in 1895. And then the two combine in an organization in 1896, creating the National Association of Colored Women. And this becomes a major organization that's actually still in existence today, advocating for the rights of African American women. So this newspaper, one of the really important things that Ruffin does is creates a platform for other leaders to gain a voice. So one of them is Mary Church Terrell, who ultimately becomes the first president of the National Association of Colored Women, and she is kind of famously pickets and advocates for civil rights well into her 80s. You can find photographs of her picketing segregated lunch counters. So Ruffin really paves the way for this. So I want you to know these two women because they were creating major organizations that really transformed the suffrage movement in significant ways, and also created really important modes of communication that, while we have easily communicate with each other on social media and Twitter, these newspapers are crucial in the 19th century for spreading ideas. And if you're interested in more about the women's suffrage movement in Massachusetts, you should definitely check out Barbara Berenson's book, Massachusetts and the Women's Suffrage Movement. And today's talk was really about suffragists, but Massachusetts was actually also the home of the nation's very first anti-suffrage organization. So we've got these great suffragists. We've also got a lot of anti-suffragists. Here's a political cartoon. And there's going to be an exhibition that I'm curating on display starting at the end of April about this debate between suffragists and anti-suffragists. And there'll be a lot of great images that I think you'll find entertaining. Thank you.
Thank you. Gavin.
So I'm going to talk about Leif Erickson. And you may be thinking, how does Leif Erickson have anything to do with molasses? And frankly, he doesn't. But it's something about just generally history being misremembered and the danger of not thinking critically about some of those things. So I first became interested in this about 7 years ago when I learned that there was a marker in Cambridge that claimed to be the site of Leif Erickson's house. So one nice spring day, I decided I'd go out and find it, and I was pretty sure I knew where it was. There's this big white rock that's on Jerry's Landing Road, right before it becomes Fresh Pond Parkway. It's clearly not a rock that happened there naturally. It happens to be right outside the property of Elmwood, which is a grand Georgian mansion that was built by Lieutenant Governor Oliver and later owned by Vice President Elbridge Gerry and then James Russell Lowell. So this seemed like a very historic spot for a marker like that to be. So I walked over to see it. And lo and behold, that rock does not have a marker on it at all. There's no plaque. And even more to my surprise, that is not actually a rock. That is a fiberglass cover that covers some kind of a utility thing. So I was a little surprised by all this, but that got me thinking about things that are not exactly what they appear to be. And from that initial surprise, I developed a tour called Misled. It was a series of stops in Cambridge of different things that were somehow portraying themselves different than they actually were. For example, there are mimic houses. So just as a very simple example, there's a mimic of Elmwood about 4 blocks away from Elmwood. There's also a mimic of the Hooper Lee Nichols house that's just a couple blocks down Brattle Street, so they're on the same street. There's a very young-looking Washington elm, which still has a plaque that says, "Under this tree, George Washington took control of the Continental Army." There is, of course, famously the statue of John Harvard that is known as the Statue of Three Lies. And, of course, there is a marker for the site of Leif Erickson's home. Somewhat forlorn. It's very close to Mount Auburn Hospital. If you don't know where it is, you will never see it. So it's something you need to really look for. So while I was looking into this tour, most of the stories that I was coming up with were just sort of funny observations. But the Leif Erickson story became a lot more interesting. For one thing, there are a lot of markers related to Leif Erickson. Probably the most famous is the statue on Com Ave. Probably following that, the next would be the prows of Viking vessels, which decorate the Longfellow Bridge. And not to jump on Longfellow too much since he's already come up before, but he's going to come up again very shortly. But if you keep looking for Viking stuff, there's Viking things all over the place. This is the entrance to Building 5 at MIT. This is the entrance to the Weld Boathouse at Harvard. This is the Board of Trade building on Broad Street in Boston. There's a tower in Weston that denotes the Viking settlement of Norumbega. There was an amusement park in Newton that was called Norumbega Park that opened in 1897 and ran until 1963. As sort of a random aside, when I was in college, I also worked as a cook in a restaurant called Norumbega Park for a relatively brief time, which is, I think, long since gone now. And then there are all the place names. Part of Wellesley College sits on top of Norumbega Hill. There's Norumbega Street in Cambridge, Norumbega Road in Weston, Norumbega Terrace in Waltham, and Norumbega Court in Newton. And if you remember the plaque that denoted Leif Erickson home, it said, "On this spot in the year 1000, Leif Erickson built his house in Vineland." So if you look, there's also Vineland Street in Brighton, Vineland Street in Worcester, and finally the somewhat straightforward Viking Street in South Boston. So where does this all come from? Were there Vikings in Boston, and what else is going on here? Most people who talk about this start with the story of Eben Norton Horsford. He's certainly central to the story, but it begins well before him. And I just want to say that while there is archaeological evidence that ships from northern Europe made it to North America before Christopher Columbus, this evidence was discovered in the 1960s, long after all these Viking monuments were erected. The evidence, along with earlier interpretations, also suggests that Vikings that made it to North America landed in Newfoundland, which is a lot closer to Greenland than Boston. And I think if you think about people sailing from Iceland to Greenland to Newfoundland, that kind of makes sense, whereas the other trips seem a lot more arduous. So I think that just a little bit of a critical eye on this. One early outlier to the general consensus that the Vikings hadn't come this far south was Carl Christian Raff, who published his book, and I'm going to totally massacre this, but Antiquitatis Americanae in 1837. It was based on Nordic lore, and he hypothesized the Vikings had sailed to New England. An American edition of his work was released in 1841 and captured the imagination of many. And this was, it was a romantic idea. It was these, strong Vikings braving the North Atlantic and coming to Boston. And it also really reaffirmed the idea that Boston was the hub of the universe. So it's not that surprising that also in 1841, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow released the poem The Skeleton in Armor, in which he described a skeleton that had been unearthed in Fall River, Massachusetts in 1832. The skeleton was found buried with artifacts, including a metal chest plate. Although most people at the time believed it to be a Native American warrior, Longfellow described it as a Viking, and this really sort of supported this theory of the Vikings coming to North America and to New England. The stories continued to circulate, and there are a number of different sites that were discovered, but nothing that was ever conclusively proved. And then in 1877, Ole Bull suggested that there should be a statue to Leif Erickson in Boston. So who was Ole Bull? Ole Bull was a world-famous Norwegian violin prodigy, which is a phrase that you don't get to use that often. He began performing as a self-taught performer, although he later received formal musical training. Beyond being a musical prodigy, Bull was famous for being almost supernaturally charismatic and a fantastic showman. And some of the stories about Bull are hard to verify, but supposedly on his 66th birthday, he performed the violin from on top of a pyramid. Who knows if that actually happened, but he was clearly one for spectacle. He spent most of his life traveling and performing, met the nobility of Europe and the cultural luminaries in America, including people like Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Later in his life, after the death of his first wife, he met Sarah Chapman Thorpe while he was touring in Wisconsin. Sarah Thorpe and her mother later traveled to Europe, and Sarah and Ole were married in 1870. At the time of their marriage, she was 20 and he was 60. They traveled the world for years before Sarah Bull moved to Cambridge in 1879 with her mother and daughter. Just to make sure this story comes all the way around, she moved to Cambridge and rented Elmwood and stayed there where the story started. In 1880, Ole Bull died at the age of 70 with Sarah at his side in Norway. She returned to Cambridge, where most of her family had gathered, and in 1833 published Ole Bull, a memoir, and began lobbying for a Leif Erickson statue in memory of her past husband. At this point, Sarah Bull was still pretty young. She was a world traveler. She was tremendously wealthy and increasingly the center of the social scene in Boston. In 1885, her brother Joseph married Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's daughter, Annie Allegra Longfellow, helping to cement the family's social status. And it's around this time, around 1880, that Eben Norton Horsford starts becoming very actively involved in this campaign for a monument to Leif Erickson. So what exactly ignited his passion? It's hard to say exactly, but he lived on the corner of Craigie Street and Brattle in Cambridge, which would have put him right in between Elmwood and Longfellow's house. So he certainly would have been aware of the fact that the most prominent members of his neighborhood were advocating for this. One interesting story about his interest in this was that it was spurred by a meeting of the Massachusetts Historical Society. In 1880, William Everett, the son of Edward Everett, read a paper at the May meeting of the Society in which he called for MHS to publicly oppose the erection of a monument to Leif Erickson. In essence, he said that there was no proof that Vikings had set foot in New England, and that until proof was found, it was a disservice to the historical record to celebrate it. He also did this in a relatively snarky tone, so it may not have made him so many friends. Supposedly, this was enough to get Eben Norton Horsford to dedicate the rest of his life to proving that the Vikings had made it to New England. It's hard to say if this really was the reason that Horsford went off on this path, but he did spend the rest of his life essentially in a war of publications with members of MHS. In 1887, MHS had had enough and appointed a committee to consider the question of the alleged early discovery of America by Norsemen. Their findings did not support Horsford. In fact, they concluded their report by saying that they thought, quote, there is the same sort of reason for believing in the existence of Leif Erickson that there is for believing in the existence of Agamemnon. Horsford was not pleased with this report. So, who was Eben Norton Horsford? He was born in 1818 in northwestern New York in a very isolated town. His father was a missionary and his mother was well-read. He was educated at the Rensselaer Institute of Troy, today called the Rensselaer Polytechnical Institute, and in 1844 traveled to Germany and studied chemistry, and upon his return was able to secure an appointment as the Rumsford Professor at Harvard University. He was a successful professor, concentrating mostly on chemistry of food. He published a number of papers and received a number of patents while he was a professor, and in 1856 received a patent for baking powder, which is how everybody knows him today. His baking powder is still the most popular and still available in grocery stores today. In 1858, he established the Rumsford Chemical Works, and in 1863 resigned his position at Harvard to concentrate on his commercial work. Prior to becoming obsessed with Vikings, he was a very highly recognized citizen. He was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and was famous for having developed Horsford's acid phosphate, which was described as an agreeable preparation of the phosphates for the indigestion, nervousness, mental, and physical exhaustion, which sounds like it's good for just about everything. He actually did this largely out of the goodness of his heart and donated this phosphate to the Union Army for the care of the soldiers and was heralded as a real hero for his patriotism. He was a successful inventor, a businessman, but at the end of his life, he spent his fortune, his social capital, and his intellectual legacy to support the idea that Vikings not only sailed to North America, but specifically to Cambridge and the surrounding town. He personally financed the statue on Commonwealth Ave, the Norumbega Tower in Weston, and of course the marker of Leif Erickson's house in Cambridge. He spent the rest of his life self-publishing books and monographs defending his theories, many of which were very pointedly responding to criticisms from quite highly qualified people. So my question is, why was this so important to him? Why did he just sort of run crazily into this? I can understand Ole Bull wanting to celebrate his own culture. I can understand Longfellow being attracted to the romanticism of the image of Vikings landing in New England. But in the end, neither of them actually spent money to build a monument. They advocated for it. They said this was a good idea, but they didn't actually go out and buy the monument themselves. While both of them were fully capable of doing it, both of them were wealthy enough to do that without question. But it was Eben Norton Horsford who really went out of his way and actually spent his own capital to do this. So the question is, why was he doing this? And to some degree, we may never know, but my theory is that at least in some level, it stems from a deeply nativist sentiment. In the 1880s and 1890s, America and this area sees a huge influx of immigrants from Southern European and a huge influx of Catholics. In this graph, you can see the populations of people born in Southern Europe, specifically Italy, Portugal, Spain, and Greece. And you can see that essentially in 1870, there's none of them in Boston. By 1890 and 1900, there's a huge population. So there's a massive wave of people coming in. Clearly, slightly different between Boston and Cambridge. In Boston, it's almost entirely Italian. In Cambridge, it's actually more Portuguese than Italian, but there's a big uptick in both of them. Anyways, so these groups faced huge discrimination. There was just outright hatred of these groups coming in. And I think that this coupled with 1892 being the 400th anniversary of Christopher Columbus's voyage, as well as the date of the launching of the Columbian Exhibition in Chicago, which was the largest World's Fair in American history, gave great urgency to Horsford to proving that America had been discovered by a Viking, not by an Italian sailing under a Spanish flag. I'm not the first person to suggest this. In an article in volume 40 of the Cambridge Historical Society's Proceedings, Wendell Garrett wrote, "For most of us today, I believe it is difficult to appreciate fully the heat and controversy generated by Horsford's drumming of the Norseman cause during the period preceding the quadricentennial year of 1892, at the same moment when every schoolboy and scholar, preacher and politician, judge and journalist was feverishly preparing to resurrect a very tired Columbus and 1492 for a 400th year celebration. The timing of the publication of Horsford's book, immediately preceding the 1892 Columbian celebrations, broke like a thunderclap over the historical landscape. The Norse discovery issue quickly degenerated into an emotional debate, dividing individuals and groups along ethnic and nationalist lines." So clearly, somebody else has thought this before. But it's interesting to look, if you look over the 20th century of when these stories come up again, because they do. Over and over again, the issue of Vikings discovering North America comes up, and they tend to come in sort of waves. And if you just scan newspapers when examples of Leif Erickson's name or Vikings are in the newspapers, they're often in and around 1924, the late 1930s, and the early 1940s. And if you think about that in the national context, in 1924, you have the Immigration Act that limited the number of immigrants allowed entry into the United States through a national origins quota. So it's people thinking about what kind of immigrants we're going to let in. In 1937, people were able to successfully lobby to have Columbus Day declared a holiday. So again, it brings up this flashpoint. And then, of course, in the early 40s, the U.S. is involved in World War II, as is Italy. So I guess the moral of my story, or what I'm saying, is that while it's kind of fun to look at the Viking monuments in Cambridge, and it's kind of funny to see Leif Erickson, he's gazing off at the Charles Gate East underpass, since at this point he's now staring at a highway. It might be worth thinking a little bit about what these stories actually symbolize. And then just as one final last thing, I would point out that actually the marker that denotes where Leif Erickson's home is not only is historically inaccurate in terms of Leif Erickson coming to Cambridge, but it's also in the wrong place. This is actually the site that the monument or the marker was originally erected. And then in 1966, they extended Memorial Drive, and they needed the land. So they picked it up and moved it about 1,000 yards. So not only did Leif Erickson not build a house in Cambridge, but it's in the wrong place. So, thank you.
Thank you, Gavin. And I love the way, with your story, you brought it back around to the Italians, and who, of course, started the story tonight as we were talking about the tragedy of the Molasses Flood. So, to follow up on what you said, and to bring the other panelists in, and also to bring our own misremembered history in, when Longfellow published the poem about Paul Revere's ride, antiquarians and historians in Massachusetts immediately started to attack him for misremembering the history. But in that attack, they were also trying to cover up what Longfellow was trying to do, which was write a pro-union abolitionist poem. And so now when people come to Old North, they have no idea that that poem was written in 1860, and it has a history in and of itself. So my question for the panelists, and following up on Gavin's presentation, is how much do you think politics has to do with our misremembering history? I mean, the Molasses Flood in part was about a great industrial accident and the lawsuits that came out of that. led to changes in public policy, and yet that's never taught. And one side of the women's suffrages movement is taught by those who are involved, but those who write history talk about themselves and not other folks. So for all the panel, when we talk about misremembering history, how much of that do you think is accidental versus how much do you think of that is intentional and has some political aims behind it?
Go first, Allison.
All right. Yeah. So in the case of the suffragists, there was a very pointed effort to make choices about who they wanted to remember for sure. They included They, for example, included only portraits of white women in their book. They really wanted to imagine women as political leaders in a way that people really never had before, which is on the one hand a really wonderful thing, and on the other hand they made very specific choices about who they wanted to portray and why.
So I think in the Molasses Flood, it's not so much that politics is part of the misremembering of history. There is politics that kind of is in the moment. So this tank was built in one of the most congested neighborhoods in the country, which was the North End at the time, about 40,000 people in about a square mile of inhabitable space, just to get your arms around that. But it was built in a neighborhood where about 60% of the Italians who lived there weren't citizens yet, couldn't vote, had very little to say about what happened in their own neighborhood. So there's barely a whimper from the political hierarchy when the tank's built. There's barely a whimper when the tank starts leaking from day one. And even after it collapses, even after this disaster, there's like 2 days of outrage from Honey Fitz, who's the congressman still, and Andrew Peters, who's the mayor. But even that, I think, dissipates. So I just think if politics played a role at all, it was in downplaying both the construction of the tank and the disaster afterwards.
So, I mean, I think that depending on which piece you look at, and later publications, like in the 1920s, that are talking about Vikings are just explicitly political and explicitly biased. I think someone like Eben Norton Horsford had a really deeply seated intrinsic view of the world, and he made the evidence fit his view of the world. I'm not sure that he was consciously doing that to discriminate against Italians, because I don't know that he was, who knows if he was really even thinking that. I think that he just had a really deeply set bias. And he believed that North America, or America, was specifically this chosen land, and it must have had this history that it was, discovered by the most northern of the northern Europeans, and that was the Vikings. And the idea that it was an Italian just did not fit with his vision of the world, and so he found the evidence to prove what he believed. So, but I think later it became much, much more explicitly political.
Thank you. Now, I want to open this up to questions from the audience, and Erica will help guide people to microphones if they would like to ask some questions. So why don't we start with, see a line up in the gallery, so why don't we start up there?
Hi, I was wondering about when monuments are built to protect, quote unquote, the people who they want remembered, but then they lose their control of the monuments is lost over time by that group. So I'm thinking of the Provincetown Monument, which was built by largely Protestant inhabitants of Provincetown in response to the large influx of Portuguese in that town. And it was built to commemorate the kind of Protestant founding of the United States by the landing of the ship in Provincetown first and then in Plymouth. But then, more recently, it's become a freedom symbol for lesbian and gay and transsexual, bisexual people as a monument to freedom, to personal freedom. So it got lost. The control of it was lost. And I wonder if that happens inevitably to every monument.
I mean, I think monuments today are a really hot subject, and I think that there's a lot of controversy around them. I think that some monuments are so explicit in their support that it's hard for them to lose it's hard for them to be appropriated by another group. So I think that I don't think it is an inevitability, but I think it's true. You build something and then it's going to stand for 200 years. You certainly don't have control over how it's interpreted 200 years later. But, you know.
Hi, I'm Linda Morrison from Newton, and Mr. Puleo, I want to ask a question of you. The Molasses Flood question, when I read Dark Tide shortly after it was published, my big question is, why in the world did they need to keep so much molasses? And learning that it was for industrial alcohol answered that question, but it seems to me that is part of why people haven't heard of it, because it doesn't make any sense. Why did they have all this molasses? What was it for?
Yeah, so you're right. United States Industrial Alcohol, who owned the tank on the North End waterfront, also had a distilling plant in East Cambridge, in the Lechmere section of Cambridge, where molasses would get distilled into industrial alcohol. So think of things like turpentine and dyes and paint thinners, that sort of thing. But also, during the First World War, most of the molasses stored in that tank was distilled into industrial alcohol and further processed and used in the production of munitions during the First World War. TNT, nitroglycerin, high explosives, that kind of thing. So it was a perfect location for the big molasses steamers that came up from Puerto Rico and Cuba and the West Indies, for them to offload their hundreds of thousands of gallons of molasses in their holds into this tank. And then from the tank, it was moved by oil cars, to East Cambridge, about a mile away, right past Leverett Circle in the Museum of Science, right down there. So yeah, perfect location for that whole production activity to take place. Yeah.
This is a question actually for Allison specifically. A lot of the abolition movement in Boston was driven by very influential and forceful women, and that after the Civil War, after the amendments, that energy got redirected in a lot of different directions, and certainly the suffrage movement was top of mind. But can you talk to any of the other areas where all that newfound power and influence was put to?
Sure, that's a great question. So after the Civil War, certainly a lot of women went into the suffrage movement. A lot of women and men supported the suffrage movement. But actually the most significant women's movement post-Civil War was prohibition, temperance, so anti-alcohol movement. So the Women's Christian Temperance Union was actually the largest women's organization in the late 19th century. And ultimately, they actually supported suffrage as a way to have women eventually, their hope was that women would eventually outlaw alcohol. And so the 18th Amendment, as you know, passed before the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote. But by then, to be fair, women in many states across the United States had already won the right to vote by the time the 18th Amendment passed. So yes, the prohibition movement, I would say, is actually even more powerful. It's a controversial thing for a suffrage historian to say, but even more powerful than the suffrage movement at that time. Mm-hmm.
Yes, I'd like to know a little bit more about the physicality of the flood, the molasses flood. I heard what caused the explosion, and I've heard stories that it was a 10-foot wall of molasses moving at such incredible speeds per second. Could you talk a little bit more about the physicality of the actual flood?
Sure. So it's interesting you use the word explosion because, of course, in the court case that follows, the plaintiff's lawyers objects to the use of the word explosion all the time because the defense, the company itself puts on as their defense that an anarchist dropped a bomb into the tank and that caused the collapse or the explosion, as they call it. So there's constant objections by the plaintiff's lawyer as to calling it an explosion. I mean, basically, the cause of the flood or the cause of the tank's collapse was, first of all, it was built in a very substandard, shoddy manner, which comes across in court numerous times, including the steel being thinner than the specs called for. This was a steel-plated tank that was held together with thousands of rivets in lap joint construction, so one piece of steel over another, and it wasn't built properly. It wasn't plumb. Lots of things about the construction, but the physicality itself. So think of this as a holding tank. There's cold molasses in the tank. About 2 days before the explosion, about 700,000 gallons was added to the tank to bring it up to its 2.3 million gallon capacity. And when that tank is pumped off of the steamer, it's heated, so it flows easily along a 220-foot intake pipe that really connects to the bottom of the tank. So it flows into the bottom. So when the warm molasses hits the cold molasses, there is a fermentation process, gas process. Everybody knows that's the case. There are vent pipes on the top of the tank to allow the gas to escape. Sometimes, however, the cold molasses acts as a tamp on that gas, and it puts pressure on the outside walls. U.S. Industrial Alcohol, the plaintiffs say U.S. Industrial Alcohol should know this and should have built the tank with a stronger factor of safety. But because the tank was poorly built, that pressure on the outside walls caused the collapse. The initial wave comes out at about 35 feet high, about 35 miles an hour. It levels off to about 20 feet high and 160 feet wide, and just takes out all of Commercial Street, all of the North End paving yard, which is like a DPW municipal yard. The location of the tank now is down at the bocce courts, and there's a softball field, baseball field, it's right there. So it goes south down, most of it goes southward down Commercial Street. And you need to think of this as like a small tidal wave. I mean, it literally scours everything in its path. People, buildings, carts, horses, you name it. Does that answer? Is that good? Yeah, okay.
Okay, thanks. Hi. I have two questions, one for Stephen, one for Allison. The first question is that I read the Molasses Flood when it first came out in hardback.
Thank you. I love those early adopters, yes.
On paper, and I don't even remember if I had a computer at that time. So I'm wondering how your research would have been different had you done the research today. Because I know that you opened up court documents that were still sealed or something like that.
Yeah, so the damage awards had never been used before, so I broke the seal on that, which was great. When you do research as a historian, you put on those little white gloves in the archives and they turn black. That's exciting, right? Because you're opening up these records that haven't been used. So that was fun. And the social law library is all, at the time, I just found out tonight that they now have some of the records on a flash drive, which they did not. These were 40 big volumes that I just went through and read. So I guess I'd use the flash drive today, for sure. The records aren't digitized, and it's not like the Mass Historical Society has the Adams papers digitized. It's great, it's fabulous. But it's not like that now, even still. So those damage awards are not digitized, to my knowledge. I guess these this municipal, this civil lawsuit, some of the records are on a flash drive, but there's 25,000 pages of testimony. It's a big court case. Yeah.
Then my second question is compare and contrast the women's movement then to now, which sounds like we haven't made any progress on the problems between race and all that.
So comparing and contrasting the movement in 2019 versus 1919 is quite different. The goals are different. It's fair to say, though, that things have changed a lot. So we're not having quite the same debates. We do have the right to vote. That's a positive. But you're right, a lot of the same divisions that people were facing in the 19th century, divisions based on class, on race, on region. A lot of these suffrage stories do center on New York and Boston, are certainly being debated in 2019 in a very serious way. And I think that we can look back at the suffragists and see the mistakes that we made, or what we would say today are mistakes, and make different choices by looking at that history.
Hello, it's Dorothy Keeney from Boston, and this is for Stephen Puleo. Were any school children involved, and what day of the week did the flood occur?
Yeah, were school children involved? There were 2 children that were killed, both 10-year-old children. They were home from school at lunchtime. It was a Wednesday. It was about 12:15, 12:30, right around that time, and they were collecting firewood at the tank site. Normally, they would be down there scooping up molasses that had pooled around the tank from those leaks that I mentioned earlier. But one of the points that gets made in court is, had the event happened in the summer, it happens January 15th, had it happened in the summer, there was a playground right on the other side of that north end paving yard where there might have been 200 or 300 children playing. So the plaintiffs make a very strong argument that had this happened in the summer, the disaster would have been far worse.
Great. Why don't we?
I wanted to hear more about the anti-suffragist movement. We don't hear much about them because they lost.
I'm more than happy to talk about the anti-suffragists. So anti-suffragists really started getting going in Massachusetts actually in the 1880s, because Boston or Massachusetts women actually had the right to vote in school elections, which isn't a type of election we really think of as separate today, but you could vote for your school board. And so anti-suffragists start organizing then, but it's not until 1895 in Massachusetts when anti-suffragists form an organization, and that's because they do not want women to gain the right to vote in municipal and city elections. So 1895, from then on, we have the nation's first anti-suffrage movement, organization in the United States. New York forms one very soon after, and it's not until 1908 where we actually have the first national anti-suffrage organization. Just to remind you, the suffragists formed their first national organizations in 1869. So they are far ahead of the game on this. They, by then, have a really highly developed campaign, whereas the suffragists want you to know who they are. They want you to know that Stanton and Anthony are their leaders. The anti-suffragists, interestingly, go by their husbands' names. It's Mrs. So-and-so, their husband's name, right? That they don't want the notoriety. They really embrace these very traditional gender roles, and they believe that women's virtues are protected by not entering into politics. Very sincerely. It's kind of unfathomable, perhaps, to us today that women would be advocating against the right to vote, but they were very much leaders in that movement. So yes, if you want to learn more, definitely come to the exhibition in late April at Mass Historical.
Well, thank you, and thank you all for coming out tonight. This has been a lot of fun to talk about history. And